Okay, so let's take a look at colonizing islands. So we can take a look at how we think islands are made, and I must say there's some really good geology here. You can take a look at what the rocks on the islands are made of and look at the strata that we had discussed earlier. We have layers of rock that have been laid down over the ages, and you can take a look and match those strata to the strata that you might find on the mainland. So, one, if they match, and the islands, if the island, the layers of rock on the island match those of the continent, then you're pretty sure that they were at least part of the same landmass at one point. Perhaps they broke off. Perhaps these are part of a different continental or oceanic crust. This is continental crust, and they kind of slip by each other over time as tectonic plate movement moved them around. Perhaps these are volcanic islands made by volcanoes like the Hawaiian Islands are. So you can tell what these islands are made of looking at their geology. So that gives us two options when we're looking at finding life on these islands. If there's life on these islands at 450 kilometers, 800 kilometers away, separated from the landmass by ocean. So you can imagine most the animals and plants are here. Any freshwater fish that are found on the island, you have to wonder how they got there, since there's, the freshwater fish would be found on land. That would make sense if you found it in a lake or a stream here in South America. But if you found them here on the Galapagos Island, you'd have to wonder how they got there, right? A tortoise, a land tortoise found here on the Galapagos Islands, you'd have to wonder how they ever got here 800 kilometers away from the western tip of South America. Same here in the Cape Verde Islands or the Tristan da Cunha Islands. The question is, how did these forms of life get on this island? Well, there's two options. They've always been there. Perhaps before the island chain broke off, or before, but that wouldn't explain the life on a volcanic island like Hawaii. That land is being made right now. So if we take a look at a volcanic island like Hawaii, its land mass, the islands that are growing, the land mass is actually being made as it pours out of the volcano, lands in the ocean, it cools off, turns into rock. After some amount of time, that rock then grows life on it. Moss, then grasses, then trees, bushes, then trees, and then all throughout there, insects and other animals start to fill in the niches that were created by this brand new land. We'll talk about that in the next unit. It's called primary succession. But as you can see, the big volcano laid out this, wherever the magma flowed, the land was made, and then later through time, soil was produced, and life could then begin on this brand new land. So that explains it in Hawaii, because as you can see, Hawaii had grass and trees and animal life on further the hill or further away from the brand new land. So you can see how that life could invade the brand new land, fill in all the niches. What about the first life, though, that landed in Hawaii? Hawaii is way out here in the middle of, in between all the land masses, much more difficult to get to, brand new newly formed from volcanic vents, at least relative to the continents. How did life get there then? Well, it's likely that there were colonizers. There were organisms that first landed on the island and started to fill in these niches. That's probably the story here. Although the life always being there and somehow separating, I mean, some life could have started that way, but when you start to make comparison, when you start to do biogeography, which is you start to look at life in different areas and you start to compare them and find differences between them. When we look at the life on the Galapagos Islands and that in South America, we see that there's a lot of commonalities and there's a lot of differences. And we see that we can find some of the species that are found here, we can actually find them here in South America. We can look at their DNA and their RNA and their proteins, as we've discussed, all the homologies that we've discussed. We can look at structural homologies as well. And we can see that there are some species that have very strong homologies to those here in South America. In fact, most of them have some kind of genetic connection to these in South America. But there's a lot that are very novel or new to the world that are only found in the Galapagos Islands. You know, how is that? How is that possible that you could get these organisms here on this island that are very closely related to those in South America, and then all of a sudden you have well, not all of a sudden, but then you also have these other species that are very similar to those that are on the South American island, but different in very marketable ways, very marked ways, and there are, and they fill in all kinds of niches. Remembering that what a niche is, right? A niche is a space, a food, any resource that an organism takes up that others don't, right? So any kind of resource, whether it be space, food, maybe it's a fish that used to swim in, that its ancestors swam in the salt water. Now these fill in the fresh water. That's a brand new niche. So there are numerous species here on these islands that have filled in niches that on the South American island these species don't exist. Well, we can look at the famous finches from the Galapagos Islands. And by the way, the finches were not the only story that Darwin told. Darwin told the story of a lot of different animals. But as Darwin went on the Galapagos Islands, remember, his voyage on the Beagle had him stop had him leave England, which is up here somewhere, and go down around the tip of South America, come up, and they had stopped on islands and continents throughout the voyage, and he documented, described, compared all kinds of animals. He was the ship's naturalist. So when we look at the finches, and finches are small birds, we found that what he found was that the finches that you see in South America, here there are all kinds of finches with all different kinds of structural differences. Some homologies, hence they were still organized in a group of finches. But there were some that were tree finches, and some that were warbler finches, some were ground finches. So these finches took the niche on the ground. These finches took the niches that were in the trees. There were some that ate fruit. They took the niche for that particular food, right? Some that were insect eaters, so they took the niche for eating insects, another good source of food. So the cactus eaters had to have, one would hope, a longer beak, right? So that longer bill, so they can access the cactus without getting pricked. There were seed eaters that used their bills to crush the seeds, so they had larger, more stronger bills that could crush seeds rather than imagine breaking open a walnut with this beak, or with this bill. So you had probing bills that could probably pick some flowers from a cactus, or get some nutrients from a cactus. You had grasping bills that would allow them to climb trees and be able to feel around in small holes or what have you, or grab things and build nests in trees. You had crushing bills that would allow them to just crush the seeds that were tough to get to. So there's all kinds of different bills that allowed them to access different niches on the island, all radiating. See how this is radiating like the sun from one common ancestor that kept it grounded, kept it connected to the species here in South America. Today we've done DNA and RNA and protein analyses. Then he looked at structural commonalities. He looked at how the finches here in South America resembled these finches, and how were they different. He drew it all in his notes, and then later wrote about it in his books. The point is here that what you have is you must have had some colonizing finch got blown by the winds in a bad storm 800 miles onto these islands, and when that happened, there were all these niches, right? All this space, all this food, all this resource, and no predators, very few predators. So now these finches were ripe for uh, for adaptive radiation. Now, what is adaptive radiation? That's when you have one pair, in this case finches, probably one population of finches that have some kind of genetic variation, right? It could have just been two, but then you'd be limited in the genetic variation. But whatever, it could have been two. The interesting thing is, because there was so much space, there was so much food and so many resources and so few predators, so few limits on their population, they could then multiply. They could multiply in vast numbers, and so you have a lot of genetic variation. And every time you go through meiosis, you increase mutation, which increase, and you mixed up the DNA, right? You recombine the DNA in meiosis through crossing over, and just the act of sex itself, giving half the DNA of each of the different individuals that are mating. So you increase mutations, which increases genetic variation. So you have all this biodiversity, right? All this biodiversity in the end. So babies with bigger bills could survive. Babies with thinner, longer bills could survive. But as the population got larger, what do you think happened? It had a lot more biodiversity. It had a lot more genetic variation, and therefore biodiversity, and a bigger population. What do you think was starting to happen on an island? On an island that initially had a lot of space, a lot of food, and a lot of resource, because it was a small population. It got blown over, probably. So space, food, resources are available. As the population got larger, what happened? Pause it here and think about it for a second, and then write something down. And let's see if we can get on the same page. Well, as the population got larger, there was more competition. So there's a lot more competition. And so if one of these finches could, that, let's assume they're all living in trees initially, and they're all eating one kind of food and taking advantage of only a number of the many resources available. If one of these mutants, one of these diverse finches in this great large population started living on the ground rather than live in the trees. Now they have the entire ground to live in. They can have babies and fill in that entire niche, the entire space. And if they are insect eaters, while their other birds are competing for seeds, they're not competing with anyone. They have all the insects to themselves. So they have more babies, so more of their genes go on to the next generation. So you all of a sudden you start to see these insect eaters. You start to see insect eaters growing in number, right? So if you had, perhaps you had only seed eaters initially that lived in, I guess you'd have to have over here, say fruit eaters that lived in trees initially got blown over. Well, if all of a sudden you had these finches that could eat insects, right, and lived in trees. Now these guys have plenty of food, so they're filling in that niche. Well, these finches here decide to live on the ground, and maybe they had large crushing bills so they could eat the seeds that fell out of the trees. So while these guys are eating fruits and these guys are eating insects, these guys start eating seeds. And of course, their genes start multiplying because there's no one else eating seeds. They have plenty of food. Plenty of food means plenty of babies survive. And they continue improving their ability to eat. Only the biggest bills can, with the largest crunching, grinding force, get to survive the most, have the most number of babies because they eat the most number of seeds. They take advantage of this food source the best. Perhaps they could even defend themselves against other finches or any new predator that might show up throughout time. So as the niches get filled in, you start to see a lot more biodiversity. We see a radiation of species. We see speciation. These no longer mate with these. These no longer mate with these. They don't have babies with each other anymore. They live in different spaces. They've separated themselves. They might genetically be able to. Depends on how long they've been separated. But they choose not to. So then now they're a completely different species. So in order to be the same species, they have to have babies with each other naturally without being forced to. And generally those babies need to be fertile. They need to be able to have babies. So we get adaptive radiation. We get species filling in empty niches. And that's what happens on islands. That's how islands get colonized. Now you might ask, this seems kind of far-fetched that, okay, I could see maybe a bird flying out here a couple, 20, 30 miles off the coast looking for food, gets blown by a big storm on the Galapagos. But how did a tortoise get on there? How did an iguana, a 100-pound iguana, get over to the island? Well, we know from hurricanes here in the Caribbean, we know that there have been hurricanes that have blown individuals, even humans. They were holding on. And there's a story of a Dominican lady in that a really bad hurricane blew her and her baby into the ocean, and she grabbed onto a coconut tree that had also got blown in the ocean and held onto her baby, and she ended up on right here in Florida, from the Dominican Islands to Florida, a few hundred miles. uh, a human being holding onto a baby. Now you can imagine an iguana holding onto a tree. You can imagine a tortoise somehow being blown on a baby tortoise, especially holding onto it, being stuck in a big old trunk of a tree, and getting blown 800 miles over through currents uh, and winds over the Galapagos Islands to Tristan da Cunha or Cape Verde. All these kinds of animals, these land mammals can also, or land reptiles can be blown as well. Now, most of them are going to die. Most of them will drown in the ocean during the storm, etc. But if over a long period of time, if there's a storm every year, and there's obviously more than one storm every year, and this happens over hundreds of years, one could imagine that you could get a population or so, actually get blown onto these islands, and they could end up being colonizers. They could be the first. They can then start to fill in niches. So you might think, well, that just doesn't seem right. All the winds blowing material that far away from the continent. Well, look here. This is Spain, and this is Africa, and you can see that the dust storms, the great dust storms of Spain and of Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, the great winds that blow across Europe and Africa, actually take a lot of that dirt, a lot of those resources, which you could imagine there would be, if it could blow dirt that far up, why couldn't it blow a turtle or a fish or a bird? We've had instances where fish have rained down on cities as strong winds actually picked up a large amount of water and blew it up into the air, and then they landed in ponds, on rooftops, etc. So these winds can blow this material across onto islands, and you can imagine iguana could be coming off here, or some kind of animal that might survive. If a few of them, just a few, 4 or 5 of them, get blown onto an island, even 2, that would, just a male and a female, that would be enough to start populating that island. Now, this material doesn't just go from Africa to some islands off its coast, or South America, some islands off its coast. They actually cross the entire Atlantic Ocean, and a lot of that soil and dirt ends up in Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, Mexico, all throughout Central America and South America. The earth, the nutrients from Africa, from the Sahara, all get just blown over the ocean over time. These great sandstorms are famous. You've seen them in movies. I believe it was in Mission Impossible. You've seen them in many movies. I think The Mummy as well. These sandstorms are, very, very high up in the air. This is earth. This is sand. This is dirt. That high up. They go across the entire landmass and get blown all the way around the world. So it's not unthinkable that life could also get blown over these islands. Obviously, seeds are going to be the first things that get blown over there. Spores, but then the next probably would be birds. But you can see a few turtles get blown over there, an iguana. Now, we know this because we can take a look at the organisms, we can do biogeography, we can layer out where the animals are, we can look at the geology of the islands and see if there's any connection, we can look at the DNA and RNA evidence, homologies, and compare that, how closely related they are. We can also see adaptive radiation, where we might have seen, we might even still have an organism on the Galapagos Island that's genetically related to one that's in South America, but then see all these genetically linked individuals with very different mutations, with many different traits that differ from those on the island, from those they radiated from those of the mainland. And we can see their link. We can actually plot them. And we could take a look again, just looking at this interesting island here. We might think, well, it's closer to Africa. It's only 3,000 kilometers from Africa, but we would expect that African species would be more likely be found here, but actually South American species are the ones that are found here. And that's likely because the winds are generally, we call them trade winds here along this particular area of the world. The trade winds are blowing from the west to the east. So the trade winds are literally moving towards the east down in the southern hemisphere in this region. So we get a lot of many more South American species of plants and animals living here than you do African plants. There's some that get blown over here during various storms, the ones that you've seen here, the giant sandstorms that brings things across. But for the most part, we see that there's a lot of South American origin plants and animals that live here on this island. So if these animals had lived on there on their own, if they were originally there and they were isolated for so long, we would expect them to be different from those found in Africa or those found in South America. Or we'd expect them all to be the same. But to see South American species being different, African species being different, but then on this island having a little bit of both, again supports the idea that these islands have been colonized by organisms from the mainland. So again, as I've said for a long time now, when you have an island biogeography, island species tend to be very closely related. And why? Because they started from a smaller population and they don't have a lot of choices over time. So there's going to be a lot of competition to fill in niches. So you might have an iguana, one species of iguana coming in, and then over time, as adaptive radiation occurs, they start to fill in niches, and they start isolating from each other genetically by choosing not to mate with each other. You end up with 3 species of iguana. You have an iguana that lives mostly in the ocean, a marine iguana. You have a pink iguana, and then there's a land iguana, all on one island chain. So in the Galapagos Islands, you have all this biodiversity because of this idea of adaptive radiation occurring. The idea that there were no predators, there was space, there was food, there was resource, but then as the populations increased, there started to be competition. So you started to see individuals filling in niches in order to alleviate some of those pressures on space and food and resources. All right. I hope this helped.